Namah Sri Jatirajai Vivekananda Surai Satchit Sukha Sarupaya Swami Nita Puharine. The introduction, remaining part of teachings of Swami Vivekananda. In 1885, Ramakrishna developed cancer of the throat. As it became increasingly evident that their master would not be with them much longer, the young disciples drew more and more closely together. Naren was their leader, together with the boy named Rakhal, who later became Swami Brahmananda. One day, when Ramakrishna lay in the last stages of his illness, Naren was meditating in a room downstairs. Suddenly, he lost outward consciousness and went into samadhi. For a moment, he was terrified and cried out, "Where is my body?" Another of the disciples thought he must be dying and ran upstairs to tell their master. "Let him stay that way for a while," said Ramakrishna with a smile. "He has been teasing me to give him this experience long enough." Much later, Naren came into Ramakrishna's room, full of joy and peace. "Now, mother has shown you everything," Ramakrishna told him. "But I shall keep the key. When you have done mother's work, you will find the treasure again." This was only one of several occasions on which Ramakrishna made it clear that he had destined Narayan for a mission of teaching in the world. On 15th August 1886, Ramakrishna uttered the name of Kali in a clear, ringing voice and passed into the final samadhi. At noon next day, the doctor pronounced him dead. The boys felt that they must hold together, and a devotee found them a house at Baranagar, about halfway between Calcutta and Dakshineshwar, which they could use for their monastery. It was a dilapidated old place with cobras around the floor, which could be rented cheaply because it was supposed to be haunted. Here they instilled the ashes of Ramakrishna within a shrine which they worshipped daily. Encouraged by Narain, they resolved to renounce the world. Later, they took the monastic vow in the prescribed fashion. There were only 15 of them. They had almost no money and few friends. Sometimes they were altogether without food. At others, they lived only on boiled rice, salt, and bitter herbs. Each had two pieces of loin cloth, nothing more. They owned a set of clothes in common, however, to be worn by anyone who had to go out into the city. They slept on straw mats on the floor, yet they joked and laughed continually, sang hymns, and engaged in eager philosophic discussions. They were silent only when they meditated. At all times, they felt Ramakrishna's presence in their midst. Far from regarding him with awe and sadness, they could even make fun of him. A visitor to the house describes how Naren mimicked Ramakrishna going into ecstasy, while the others roared with laughter. But gradually the boys became restless for the life of the wandering monk. With staff and begging bowl, they wandered all over India, visiting shrines and places of pilgrimage, preaching, begging, passing months of meditation in lonely huts. Sometimes they were entertained by rajas or wealthy devotees. Much more often, they shared the food of the very poor. Such experiences were particularly valuable to Narain. During the years 1890 to 93, he acquired the first hand knowledge of India's hunger, misery, nobility, and spiritual wisdom, which he was to carry with him on his journey to the West. After traveling the whole length of the country, he reached Cape Comorin, and here he had a vision. He saw that India had a mission in the modern world as a force for spiritual regeneration, but he also saw that this force could not become effective until India's social conditions had been radically improved. Funds must be raised for schools and hospitals. Thousands of teachers and workers must be recruited and organized. It was then that he formed his decision to go to the United States in search of help, and this decision was later confirmed when the Raja of Ramnath suggested he should attend the then newly announced Chicago Parliament of Religions. Thus, the specific opportunity was related to Naren's general intention. At the end of May 1893, he sailed from Bombay via Hong Kong and Japan to Vancouver. From there, he went on by train to Chicago. After the closing of the Parliament of Religions, Vivekananda spent nearly 2 whole years lecturing in various parts of the eastern and central United States, appearing chiefly in Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and New York. By the spring of 1895, he was desperately weary and in poor health, but characteristically he made light of it. Are you never serious, Swamiji? Someone once asked him, perhaps with a hint of reproach. Oh, yes, he replied, when I have the bellyache. He could even see the funny side of the many cranks of and healers who unmercifully pestered him, hoping to still a reflection of his glory. In his letters, he refers jokingly to the sect of Mrs. Whirlpool and to a certain mental healer of metaphysico chemico physico religioso, what not. At the same time, he met and made an impression on people of a more serious kind. Robert Ingersoll, the agonistic, Nikola Tesla, the inventor, Madame Calvé, the singer, and most important of all, he attracted a few students whose interest and enthusiasm were not temporary, who were prepared to dedicate the rest of their lives to the practice of his teaching. In June 1895, he was invited to bring a dozen of these to a house in Thousand Island Park on the St. Lawrence River. Here, for nearly 2 months, he taught them informally, as Ramakrishna had taught him and his brother disciples. Nobody who was present ever forgot this period, and it must certainly have been much the happiest part of Vivekananda's first visit to America. In August, he sailed for France and England, returning to New York in December. It was then that, at the urgent request of his devotees, he founded the first of the Vedanta societies in America, the Vedanta Society of New York. Vedanta means the non dualistic philosophy which is expounded in the Vedas, the most ancient of Hindu scriptures. And it is, of course, in line with Vivekananda's general beliefs referred to above that he did not call his foundation the Ramakrishna Society. It was then also that he received two academic offers, the chair of Eastern philosophy at Harvard and a similar position at Columbia. He declined both, saying that as a wandering monk he could not settle down to work of this kind. In any case, he was longing to return to India. In April, he sailed for England, which was to be the first stage of his journey home. From England, he took with him two of his most faithful and energetic disciples, Captain and Mrs. Xavier, also J. J. Goodwin, an Englishman whom he had first met in America and who had become the recorder of his lectures and teachings. Later, he was followed to India by Margaret Noble, the Irish woman who became Sister Nivedita and devoted the rest of her life to the education of Indian women and the cause of India's independence. All of these, except Mrs. Xavier, eventually died in India. Vivekananda landed in Ceylon in the middle of January 1897. From there on, his journey to Calcutta was a triumphal progress. His countrymen had followed the accounts of his American lectures in the newspapers. Perhaps Vivekananda's success had sometimes been exaggerated, but they quite rightly regarded his visit to the West as a symbolic victory, far exceeding in its proportions the mere amount of money he had collected for his cause or the number of disciples he had made. Indeed, one may claim that no Indian before Vivekananda had ever met Americans and Englishmen accept him on such terms, not as a subservient ally, not as an avowed opponent, but as a sincere well wisher and friend, equally ready to teach and to learn, to ask for and to offer help. Who else had stood as he stood, impartially between East and West, prizing the virtues and condemning the defects of both cultures? Who else could represent in his own person young India of the 90s in synthesis with ancient India of the Vedas? Who else could stand forth as India's champion against poverty and oppression and yet sincerely praise American idealism and British singleness of purpose? Such was Vivekananda's greatness. In the midst of all this adulation, Vivekananda never forgot who he was, the disciple of Ramakrishna and the equal brother of his fellow monks. On 1st May 1897, he called a meeting of the monastic and householder disciples of Ramakrishna in order to establish their work on an organized basis. What Vivekananda proposed was an integration of educational, philanthropic, and religious activities. And it was thus that the Ramakrishna Mission and the Ramakrishna Mutt or monastery came into existence. The mission went to work immediately, taking part in famine and plague relief and founding its first hospitals and schools. Brahmananda was elected as its president, and to him Vivekananda handed over all the money he had collected in America and Europe. Having done this, he was obliged to ask for a few pennies in order to take the ferry boat across the Ganga. Henceforward, he insisted on sharing the poverty of his brother monks. The mott was consecrated some time later at Belur, a short distance downriver from the Kaneshwar temple on the opposite bank of the Ganga. This Belur Mutt is still the chief monastery of the Ramakrishna order, which now has nearly 100 centuries in different parts of India, 100 centers in different parts of India and neighboring Asian lands, devoted either to the contemplative life or to social service or to a combination of both. The Ramakrishna Mission has its own hospitals and dispensaries, its own colleges and high schools, industrial and agricultural schools, libraries, and publishing houses, with monks of the order in charge of them. In June 1899, Vivekananda sailed for a second visit to the Western world, taking with him Nivedita and Swami Turiyananda, one of his brother monks. This time he went by way of Europe and England, but he spent most of the next year in America. He went to California and left Triananda to teach in San Francisco. It was Vivekananda's wish to found a number of Vedanta centers in the West. At the present day, there are 10 centers in the United States, one in the Argentine, one in England, and one in France. By the time he returned to India, Vivekananda was a very sick man. He had said himself that he did not expect to live much longer. Yet he was happy and calm, glad, it seemed, to feel a release from the anxious energy which had driven him throughout his earlier years. Now he longed only for the peace of contemplation. Just before leaving America, he wrote a beautiful and remarkably self revealing letter to a friend. I am glad I was born, glad I suffered so, glad I did make big blunders, glad to enter peace. Whether this body will fall and release me, or I enter into freedom in the body, the old man is gone, gone forever, never to come back again. Behind my walk was ambition, behind my love was personality, behind purity was fear. Now they are vanishing, and I drift. Some say that Vivekananda's departure from this life on 4th July 1902 at the Belur Math had the appearance of a premeditated act. For several months previously, he had been releasing himself from his various responsibilities and training successors. His health was better. He ate his midday meal and with relish talked philosophy and went for a 2 mile walk. In the evening, he passed into deep meditation and the heart stopped beating. For hours, they tried to rouse him, but his work, it seemed, was done and Ramakrishna had given him back the key to the treasure. The best introduction to Vivekananda is not, however, to read about him, but to read him. The Swami's personality, with all its charm and force, its courageousness, its spiritual authority, its fury, and its fun, comes through to you very strongly in his writings and recorded words. In reading him, it is always well to remember that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin, hobgoblin of little minds. When Emerson wrote these words in his essay on self reliance, he was contrasting the little minds with the great minds of Jesus, Socrates, and others. No doubt, Emerson would have had added Vivekananda to his list if they could have met and come to know each other. But he died in 1882. Vivekananda was the last person in the world to worry about formal consistency. He almost always spoke extempore, fired by the circumstances of the moment, addressing himself to the condition of a particular group of hearers, reacting to the intent of a certain question. That was his nature, and he was supremely indifferent if his words of today seem to contradict those of yesterday. As a man of enlightenment, he knew that the truth is never contained in arrangements of sentences. It is within the speaker himself. If what he is true, then words are unimportant. In this sense, Vivekananda is incapable of self contradiction. Vivekananda was not only a great teacher with an international message, he was also a very great Indian, a patriot, and an inspirer of his countrymen down to the present generation. But it is a mistake to think of him as a political figure, even in the best meaning of the word. First and last, he was the boy who dedicated his life to Ramakrishna. His mission was spiritual, not political or even social in the last analysis. The policy of the Ramakrishna order has always been faithful to Vivekananda's intention. In the early 20s, when India's struggle with England had become intense and bitter, the order was harshly criticized for refusing to allow its members to take part in Gandhi's non cooperation movement. But Gandhi himself never joined in this criticism. He understood perfectly that a religious body which supports a political cause, no matter how noble and just, can only compromise itself spiritually and thereby lose that very authority which is in its justification for existence within human society. In 1921, Gandhi came to the Belur Math on the anniversary of Vivekananda's birthday and paid a moving tribute to him. The Swami's writings, Gandhi said, had taught him to love India even more. He reverently visited the room overlooking the Ganga in which Vivekananda spent the last months of his life. You can visit that room today. It is still kept exactly as Vivekananda left it. But it does not seem museum like or even unoccupied. Right next to it is the room which is used by the president of the Ramakrishna order. There they are dwelling side by side, the visible human authority and the invisible inspiring presence. In the life of the Belur Math, Vivekananda still lives and is as much a participant in its daily activities as any of its monks. So, we come to the end of the introduction part. Paro tatte shadalina Ramakrishna Shamagaya Jo Dharma Sthapana Rata Bireshang Tang Namamaham.